I will live in the past, present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Charles Dickens. Well, welcome to the Contextual Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host and author, Matthew Kutz, author of the book Contextual Intelligence, How Thinking in 3D Can Help Resolve Complexity, Uncertainty, and Ambiguity. And welcome to episode 10. In this episode, we're going to be talking about enhancing our 3D thinking. In our last episode, we highlighted the different aspects of the contextual intelligence framework and kind of dug a little bit deeper into the notions of hindsight, insight, and foresight, and how the convergence of hindsight, insight, and foresight come together to give us real-time information or data that we can use to practice contextual intelligence and to make decisions and evaluate opportunities that help us achieve our goals and the things that we're looking to accomplish in life. And in this episode, episode 10, we're going to be going even deeper into the aspect of 3D thinking. It's important for me to start this with that quote from Charles Dickens because it occurred to me several years ago. And I first started talking about contextual intelligence and doing research on contextual intelligence in the early 2000s. I believe 2004 is when I first started coming across the idea and the concept and writing about it. And then it was a few years after that, and I had already published some things and began doing corporate training on it, etc. I was sitting literally with my family around the Christmas season and watching one of our favorite Christmas movies, which is A Christmas Carol, and particularly the one with George C. Scott, the 1984 version where George C. Scott stars as Ebenezer Scrooge. I remember watching one of the culminating climactic scenes at the end when he wakes up from his dream and right after he received his last visit from the third Christmas ghost, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and he's sitting at the cemetery just having been revealed to him that if things didn't change, he would be the corpse that he saw there in the cemetery. And in that moment of insight, he says this prayer and he cries out, "I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach." And when he said that, and I was watching this film with my family, I had this moment where I thought that I had this great idea and I was beginning to develop and work on and the 3D thinking model and all those kinds of things. And I'd already been talking about hindsight, insight, and foresight and working on that. And then I hear that and I'm like, and I realized I wasn't the first person to come up with this idea. I wasn't the first person to have this idea. Here, Charles Dickens is writing about it hundreds of years ago, and he creates this whole story around what I now know as 3D thinking. And he talks about the ghosts of Christmas past, the ghosts of Christmas present, and the ghosts of Christmas yet to come, or the ghosts of Christmas future. And in that moment of realization, I realized that this would also be an incredible metaphor and a great illustration for how I mean contextual intelligence and particularly 3D thinking to be practiced in our lives here right now. There's really little better example than Ebenezer Scrooge. And then I went back and I watched it again and began to actually look at what the whole story was about. And if you remember, Ebenezer Scrooge had a business partner. His business partner's name was Jacob Marley. You remember the beginning of the story, Jacob Marley visited Ebenezer Scrooge in his house and warned him about what was going to happen, that he was going to offer him a hope, a chance to have hope in the future. That chance, that opportunity, that hope was a visitation from these three spirits. Even if you go back, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but even the incredible conversation that Ebenezer Scrooge had with Jacob Marley's ghost at the beginning of the story is also incredibly insightful when it comes to how we're supposed to pay attention to what's going on around us, which is the whole aspect of contextual intelligence. And we recognize that Jacob Marley is trying to warn him, if you continue on this path, you're going to end up with the same fate as I have. You're going to be doomed to walk around eternity with this heavy chain that you're building yourself right now, and you don't even realize it. And this is kind of what is so critical about understanding the 3D thinking framework is there's so many opportunities that we miss. There's so many decisions that we fail to assess accurately because we're not aware of what's going on around us. And one of the things that we can do to become more aware or better aware of what's going on around us is practicing 3D thinking and beginning to take seriously hindsight, insight, and foresight. And the story of Ebenezer Scrooge and how Charles Dickens portrays that event is absolutely profound. And at the risk of stealing, someone else's idea, I just want you to recognize and see how important it is that you practice hindsight, insight, and foresight accurately and not just give it lip service. This is an idea now that's been around for quite a long time, and it's been conveyed in different ways. And I just want to take it one step further and introduce this mindset to you from the perspective of business, leadership, decision-making, evaluating opportunities, developing better relationships. All of these things can benefit from 3D thinking. And just like Ebenezer Scrooge needed someone to point that out to him with the visitate from Jacob Marley and the 3 visits from the 3 spirits, think of me as your Jacob Marley telling you, listen, if you don't take seriously hindsight, insight, and foresight, if you don't let yourself be visited by the spirits of hindsight, the spirits of insight, and the spirits of foresight, you will be doomed to a fate that you don't even know you're creating for yourself. And I would implore you, beg you even, like Jacob Marley did to Scrooge, to please reconsider how you're evaluating the world that you're in, how you're living in the world you're in, the rules and the heuristics that you're living by right now. And there is no better way to evaluate the rules of thumb that you are living by, the assumptions, the heuristics that you're using to make decisions, than by going back to and taking seriously hindsight, insight, and foresight. So I'm asking you to kind of be your own Christmas ghosts. Seriously consider, what is it about hindsight that I'm not aware of that I need to revisit? And just like Ebenezer Scrooge needed a ghost to show him exactly what it was, we all have hindsight and we all understand what hindsight is, our past, the memories, things like that, precedent, tradition. But few of us recognize how significant events in our past shaped and framed who we are. And just like Ebenezer Scrooge needed someone to take him back and point out how certain events created and developed a frame of mind in him for the future, we also need that. And just like Ebenezer Scrooge couldn't do it on his own because of hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is something that keeps us from seeing the past accurately. So in other words, and we all are victims of hindsight bias. Because of hindsight bias, because of our inability to see the past clearly, because of our inability to see the past with clarity, we need help in seeing the past. Practicing hindsight accurately cannot be done in isolation. You can't do it by yourself. You have to have somebody help you. That somebody is usually an opponent in your life, someone who you trust, but someone who thinks differently than you do. So you need to find someone who you can trust, who you believe has your best interest in mind, but always seems to challenge what it is you're saying and what it is you're doing. Find that person or those people. We all have them in our lives, and we're sometimes afraid to ask them what they think because we know that they're going to disagree with what we're thinking and what we're doing. Well, it's these people that you need to be your ghost of Christmas past or your hindsight checker for you, because it's these people that help us get past hindsight bias the quickest. What I need you to do then is think about those things in your past where you've learned something, where you've formed it, where you've shaped the lesson from the past into something that you use today. This is where our heuristics come from. This is where our rules of thumb come from? This is one way to begin to develop and understand how to apply and use tacit knowledge correctly, which is something we talked about in the previous episode. But in order for us to understand that, we have to have this person challenge what it is we think we learned from the past. They do it in two ways. One, they help us revisit moments and areas in the past that we forgot about that were formative. That's critical. So you want to begin to think. So one of the first things you can do is begin to ask yourself, all right, what are the formative experiences of my past? What memories do I routinely go to give me insight into things that I'm trying to deal with right now, or that I would anticipate about the future? So make a list of what those are, and then go to people who were alive and around at those moments of time and ask them what else was going on, because we selectively remember things. So we need people to help us be more aware of what actually happened in the past. So that's one way they help us. The other way they help us is by bringing back to mind details about that moment that we forgot or neglected to remember. And there's a difference between forgetting something and not remembering something. And we don't want to get into that here. Needless to say, those people can help you recall some of the things that were salient at the moment that you forgot about now, or that you no longer remember as salient. Once you have that list of ideas, that list of memories, those lists of experiences, a list of people who can help you with that, then you've got to ask yourself this question: what experiences have I had that are biasing me toward new things? That's a great question you can ask yourself, and something that will help you discover the rules, the assumptions that you've made, how you formed them, how you created them, and then it can help you recalibrate what you need to be looking at right now in the present. The second question you can ask yourself are, how are my memories biasing how I perceive opportunities? It's very similar to the previous question. The third question: how has my interpretation of what happened to me defined me? And then the fourth question I would offer that you should be asking through the lens of the Ghost of Christmas Past or the Hindsight is, who is the best reality checker for how I interpret and apply what I believe happened to me? I'll say that again. Who is the best reality checker for how I interpret and apply what I believe happened to me? And the reason why this question is so important is because it brings in another person, and hopefully other people, plural. It's never just enough for you to try to remember the past on your own, and you try to remember the salient features and characteristics that shaped who you are and why you think the way you do. One of the more critical things about doing hindsight correctly is identifying the right people who can help you remember what actually happened, not your version of it. Hindsight bias, as I mentioned a moment ago, is something that every single human on the planet is subject to, and that's the risk and the temptation to misremember the past in our favor. And hindsight bias actually causes us to remember everything with us, with me, with I being the central character in that memory. And the reality is, you are not the central character in that memory. This is one reason why it's so important to bring in other people to help you with this, because they will remember it as themselves or someone else being the central character in the memory. And just that little plot twist is often enough to get you to see it differently than how you would have otherwise. And that's what we're about. The Ghost of Christmas Past, or the hindsight mindset, is about plot twisting the past enough without changing any of the facts or details, but changing the plot twist enough by taking you out of the central character, the hero or heroine character role, and placing yourself as an extra in the memory, and then using that to view it and see what else you observe about that moment. And we always need someone else to help us do that. So that's how the hindsight mindset can help us. And that's exactly what Ebenezer Scrooge needed for him to begin to put together the pieces of his past that framed who he was. And there were several memories that the ghost of Christmas past took him to, just like there should be several memories that you go back and visit that you see have accumulated over time to help create something for yourself. The next thing then is the ghost of Christmas present, or the insight mindset. Now, the insight mindset will help you ask these questions, and here's just a few examples. Number one, what opportunity is presenting itself to me right now? And I mean immediately, like right now in this moment, not what am I currently on my plate that I need to consider in the next 6 months. I mean, what opportunity is before you right now? Should I eat this third slice of pizza or call it a day? Should I set my alarm clock for 6 a.m. and then when it goes off, should I get up? Should I not? And begin to be more present in the moment. And begin to think about how many decisions you're actually making that contradict or support what you wanted to do yesterday. Let that sink in for a minute. That's important. So that's why it's important to ask, what opportunity is presenting itself to me right now? Okay. Again, not talking about an opportunity that you have to invest in this fund that's going to pay off in 6 months. That's a foresight thing. I'm asking you to ask from the moment to moment decisions that you counter throughout your day. The next question is, what is my present state of mind and how it is affecting my attitudes and behaviors? You need to ask yourself that question fairly regularly, moment to moment. You always need to be aware of, this is metacognition. You always need to be aware of what you're thinking and how your thinking is filtering what you're doing. Richard Paul said it this way: tacit knowledge or critical thinking, or what we're talking about here, is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to change your thinking. So thinking about your thinking while you're thinking. You can't do that unless you're present in the moment. The third question is, what filter or what heuristic, what assumption is coloring what you're seeing right now in this moment? Okay. And you want to ask yourself that. And when we get good at asking and answering and responding to these three questions, our insight increases dramatically. And that's really, really important. And that's what the Ghost of Christmas Present does. That's what the insight mindset is all about, is helping you understand what's actually happening right now. Again, because we filter everything through some other lens, and we tend to see what we want to see instead of what actually is. Peter Drucker and others have called this incongruity. When we recognize something that is happening is incongruent with what we expected or hoped to happen. And the issue is, life is full of incongruities, but we ignore the incongruities of life because they don't match up with what we think or hope will happen. So we need to be aware of these incongruities, and this is the value of insight. The third mindset is the foresight mindset, or this is the ghost of Christmas yet to come, right? The ghost of the future. Here's a few questions to help you with that. Again, the idea being you need to be your own Christmas ghost here. One is, how well do you describe the ideal future to others? And this is important because pay attention to my words here. And by describe, I mean literally articulate. I don't just mean how well do you cast a vision per se or something like that, but it includes that, but it's more than that. When you are describing the future to someone, how well do you describe it? Can they see what you see? If they can't, that's on you, not on them. If they can't see what you see, then you need to work on your ability and capacity to describe what it is that you're trying to paint. And that's really, really important. And someone who has foresight can actually describe and literally articulate, either with verbal words or in writing. Usually it starts with writing, and then you transfer that from writing to verbally. Most of the time, we don't even know what we think until we can write it out. So that's one way to determine what it is that you even think you know, or what it is that you know, is try writing it first. And once you can articulate it in writing, then you need to practice articulating it verbally. The next question from the foresight mindset is, what obstacles are keeping me from doing what I truly want to do or be, and how can I navigate around them? One of the critical things to distinguish between is foresight and fantasy. Most of the time when you enter into the ghost of Christmas yet to come, so to speak, or thinking about the future and foresight, we fantasize and we imagine a future that's not possible in the current conditions. And that's okay to do, but just recognize that as fantasy. Now, we can make our fantasy a reality, but the intermediate step between taking a fantasy and making it reality is practicing foresight. Most people skip that foresight stage and they get frustrated because their fantasy never happens. Well, your fantasies can happen, but they have to be devolved down or broken down into foresight first. Foresight is different from fantasy in this respect. Fantasy says, I want to do X, but I can't because. So fantasy always involves the I can't because clause. Foresight, on the other hand, has an answer to the I can't because clause. So foresight would say, I want to do X, and here's what I can do today to move toward X. And that's how you do it. And that's a subtle difference, but it's a major difference. And most people spend their time in fantasy instead of foresight. And by asking the question, what obstacles are keeping me from what I truly want to do and be, and how can I navigate around them? We're taking it out of the realm of fantasy and bringing it into the realm of foresight. And now I can begin to articulate the things I need to do today to create the future I want tomorrow. And then the third question that I'll end this with is, what specifically must I navigate to get around my obstacles? And then, of course, that includes and requires understanding what your obstacles are and naming your obstacles. So I would name your obstacles as an important part of the movement from insight to foresight. Let's just do a fictitious example here and say, how well do I describe the ideal future? And we say, my ideal future includes a loving relationship with my spouse, but I can't because my spouse thinks I'm a jerk. All right. So again, our job isn't to make excuses or anything like that. It's to list my obstacle. My obstacle is I'm a jerk. So what can I do today to stop being a jerk? And then you make your list. And now you're moving towards the future that you want to create. And this is what the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come does. They show you things that aren't yet, but will be if you continue on this same path. And by showing you that, you are forced to look at the obstacles that are keeping you from being where you want to be. So you want to identify those things. And that's something that, again, can be very helpful if you bring in an outside person to help you see that more clearly. So that's just a summary of the beginning part of chapter 9 in the book. And then the next half of the chapter then moves into some specific things. And I'll just kind of cap off this podcast with these things. There are things you can do to work on your temporal skills. So obviously you recognize hindsight, insight, and foresight are understanding the temporal reality of the world we live in, the time-based orientation that we live in, and how important it is to have input from all three time orientations instead of defaulting to one dominant time orientation like many of us tend to do. The person who practices 3D thinking moves away from the tendency to have a dominant time orientation and invites input, equal input, in fact, from all three time orientations. So that's a temporal skill. That's having a time-based awareness of reality. To work on that, we can do things like time warping. Time warping requires the cognitive manipulation of the past and the future by making them seem closer to the present. In essence, it involves us using your imagination to skip to some point in time, whether it be past or the present, and then thinking about what you would do now versus what you did then. Commonly people will do exercises like, well, if I knew now what I knew then. Take that seriously and really look at what that means. And then also think about, we talk about writing letters to our future self. It's also every bit as important to write letters to your past self. You want to do both. Those are important time warping skills. Another thing you can begin to develop is time chunking. Time chunking involves grouping together segments of time, referring to segments as hours, days, months. For example, this skill can help you manage future events today, since you can create a future by placing a higher priority on a specific chunk of time. For example, you can say, we have 4 weeks to complete this project, making all 4 weeks important right now. That's an example of time chunking and a good strategy you can use to become more temporally minded. So that's kind of where I wanted to take this particular episode, and there's a lot more in there, and that's a neat concept to think about, but I wanted to just part with reminding you how important it is that you become your own Christmas ghost. If that interested you at all, or you're interested in getting this book, I would love for you to get your hands on this book. Again, the title is Contextual Intelligence, How Thinking in 3D Can Help Resolve Complexity, Uncertainty, and Ambiguity, by yours truly, Dr. Matthew Kutz. I will have contact information for me, information on how to get your hands on this book in the show notes. In the meantime, please visit my website if you have any questions, MatthewKutz.com. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great day.